All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Geology 1404. Lecture 6 today. We're tying our conversation of sedimentary environments to what we have learned about life. But before we begin on that, any interesting stories or questions?
There was the de-evolution of the direwolf.
I was hoping someone would bring that up. Is that what you were going to bring up? Yeah, good. I'm glad some people are paying attention to this. Y'all know what a dire wolf is? A dire wolf is, as far as we're aware, the largest species of wolf that has existed. And it died out 12,500 years ago with the end of the Ice Age. Okay? Think about a wolf that stood about as tall as my shoulder. Modern day, our largest wolves that we have in the world right now are gray wolves. They stand about that high when they're full grown. They can be pretty vicious. Dire wolves stood about that high, okay? And 6 to 7 feet long. Very, very large predators, like hunted down men sort of predators. Ice Age tribes of men were preyed upon by dire wolves. Probably part of the reason why they went extinct. We'll talk about why many of the macrofauna, or the megafauna, from the Ice Age went extinct a little bit later on in the semester. But probably a big component of why the dire wolves went extinct is because they were such a threat to people, and people organized themselves to systematically hunt them down. That's happened before, many times. But thanks to some of the technology that we have now when it comes to manipulating genes, which I will talk about here later on in Module 2 next week. A company called Colossal, which has headquarters in Austin, Dallas, and Boston. This company has a few projects going, and one of them was to try and bring back the dire wolf. And they just announced yesterday that they have successfully produced 3 dire wolf puppies. Yeah.
But aren't those puppies like, you know how in the Jurassic World, how they say dinosaurs aren't really dinosaurs?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves in the class, but I absolutely love this subject, so let's talk about it for a second. When something goes extinct, it's gone. It's extinct. It's not there. Okay? It's left. Okay? In Jurassic Park, the way that they bring dinosaurs back is they get dinosaur DNA from fossilized mosquitoes, and then with whatever holes have degraded in that DNA over time, they fill them in with the DNA of other animals like frogs or lizards or things like that. And so what you end up with is an animal that has mostly dinosaur DNA and a little bit other DNA, which technically means, yes, they are not dinosaurs in Jurassic World. And the most recent movies try and push that point home. These aren't really dinosaurs. We're calling them dinosaurs. They're just the closest that we'll ever be able to get without a complete DNA strand, right? While their process has holes in it, right? You can't really do that with DNA. Their logic is fairly sound, okay? So what we can do instead is we can take an animal that exists today and then map its genome so that we can figure out what traits it has. Now, I have all of the same traits as each of you with some variation. We share a common ancestor at some point in time. You and I, Alan, might be 11th cousins, right? Anthony and I might be 9th cousins. Abby and I might be 14th cousins. Whatever the case may be, we are related at some point back in time, which means that we share the DNA of that ancestor. It's simply changed a little over time, which is why we don't look the same. We have different genes, okay? But we have the same common ancestor. So I also have a common ancestor with a dog. I also have a common ancestor with a fish. I also have a common ancestor with a tree. Some of my DNA is shared with all of those things, with, diminishing amounts as time goes on, and I diverge further and further from that ancestor, as does that other organism, right? But we can isolate which genes are held in common. So I could edit my DNA to turn on the traits that I have in common with a lizard. And if that ancestor had claws, then I can edit my DNA so that my offspring, the result of my reproduction through that DNA, will have those claws. That's how it actually works. We can manifest traits shared with ancestors. So how does this work with the dire wolf? You take a gray wolf, which is the closest living relative, right? Think of them as cousins of the dire wolf. And you can turn on certain genes in their DNA sequences that are shared with the ancestor that they had in common with the dire wolf. And all of a sudden, you get as close to a dire wolf as we will ever be able to. Not the original dire wolves back, those are gone. But now we have a new kind of wolf that we are calling a dire wolf because it's very close to the original. That's how this works. And we can do that with anything. We've been doing it for a very long time.
How close are these pups, like, to the original dire wolf?
Pretty dang close. They're going to be as big as a dire wolf. They'll have many of the same characteristics. They haven't released enough of their research for me to know exactly what the differences will be. And when it comes to dire wolves anyway, all we have really to work with are bones, right? So it's hard to tell, is the musculature exactly the same? Is the fur color exactly the same? Yeah.
I saw a video they posted, and the lead scientist, he said they use fossils.
Mm-hmm. DNA. Right, and you can compare. 12,500 years old isn't enough for the bones to have completely fossilized. So we can compare genomes from more recent ancestors, right? So we can compare that. It's still not going to be the original thing. It'll be close to it. They may actually give it the species name, but what the brass tacks of it is, the dire wolves went extinct, and we can bring a version of them back, but it's not going to be exactly the same because we made it. Okay? This is a whole thing about artificial selection that we haven't talked about yet. We will get into that next week. We talk about that a lot more. All right? But it's a fascinating story. Last year, or maybe it was the year before that, that same company, Colossal is this company, they announced that they successfully made a woolly mouse, which, is basically just a much, much hairier mouse. It was more or less an experiment to see if they could, to test some theories that they had about genetic manipulation. This is all working towards their goal of restoring some key Pleistocene megafauna. There are some organisms that went extinct when the Ice Age ended that our ecosystem relied upon. That our ecosystem relied upon, one of which was the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths, one of their main dietary needs was moss. Moss that grows in the far northern reaches of Canada and Mongolia, Siberia. Now that the woolly mammoths are gone and nothing is eating that moss, it is taking over the grasslands. And the ecosystems are suffering because the grasses are having to give way to the mosses. So, by restoring the woolly mammoth population, the theory is they'll restore the balance to the ecosystem up there. And so Colossal's main goal is to have a successful herd of woolly mammoths up in Canada and in Mongolia, I believe by 2060 is their goal. And they're knocking it out of the park, with the woolly mouse and the dire wolf so far. So I have no doubt that they'll be able to have a successful new woolly mammoth sometime soon. Yeah?
To get the woolly mammoth, they would have to put in an elephant, right?
Yes, the Asian elephant is the closest living relative to the woolly mammoth, interestingly enough, not the African elephant. The Asian elephant is. And so what they would do here is they would manipulate some of the DNA of an Asian elephant, inseminate and impregnate a female Asian elephant with this new DNA, and then that Asian elephant would give birth to essentially woolly Asian elephant, which we will then call a woolly mammoth because it's the closest that we'll be able to get. Maintain it? What do you mean? Are the Asian elephants going extinct? Is that what you're saying? How do the woolly mammoths go extinct? Okay, this is something we talk about later, but just as a quick side note for that, woolly mammoths were covered in what? Wool. Well, hair, right? We call it wool, but it's hair, right? Very thick layers of hair. And what was underneath all that hair? Fat. 10 to 16 inches of fat to insulate that body against the extreme cold of the Ice Age. Well, when the Ice Age ended, do you think that all that wool and fat was an advantage in the warming temperatures? No. And so the population started to decline. However, here's the thing. Woolly mammoths were there for ice ages and then kind of changed a little bit, lost some of that hair and fat, and then another ice age would come and they'd get it back and forth throughout time. But it's very likely that some mutations would have kept the population going. A mutation for less hair. Unfavorable in the Ice Age, right? Favorable in the warming climate. And so that would have been a positive mutation, a trait that was successfully passed down to generations. But what else happened here that was negative to the environment for woolly mammoths? A new species was introduced onto the scene. Us. We migrated over a land bridge from Russia, entered North America. And so while the woolly mammoths populations were suffering from increasing temperatures, right, about 12,500 years ago, some of them were dying to that. Some of them were probably going to survive and keep the population alive during the warming temperatures. But you add a brand new apex predator that can hunt with tools very efficiently and needed a lot of meat to sustain a growing population. And both of those factors together wiped out the woolly mammoths, the ground sloths, probably a lot of the other macrofauna that we find fossils for, of things that didn't survive the Ice Age, but very well could have if they only had one of those two things to compete with. But both of them, climate change plus humanity, that was too much. Great conversation to start the day, yeah.
When they make the mammoths, when they alter the DNA of the Asian elephants, are they gonna maybe make it so they have less hair or less fat?
Ooh, when they alter the DNA of the Asian elephants, are they going to give them less hair and less fat? Yeah, because we live in a very warm world that's only getting warmer, right? If you make the original woolly mammoth, that population's going to die off pretty quick. So yeah, they are not giving them the traits to store as much fat or to grow as much hair. More or less, they are making organisms that share the same metabolism requirements, the same body size, tusk size, things like that. Pretty much everything except their adaptations to the extreme cold is what they're giving them. It's still very possible that the population may not survive. We may start seeing, and this is an unfortunate truth. Do you remember our conversation about elephants last time? About the elephants in Kenya? What's the biggest threat to all the elephants in Africa? Poachers, yeah. It's very possible that once there are successful populations of woolly mammoths, we may unfortunately start to see a poaching problem in northern Russia and northern Canada. Possible side effects of doing this project. It's a fascinating project, very probably going to be beneficial for the ecosystem of these areas, but we'll see where it takes us. Great conversation. Any other comments or questions about that? Yeah.
They just say the next thing they want to make is the Tasmanian tiger.
Tasmanian tiger. The Tasmanian tiger only went extinct in the 1800s. That one won't be as hard to bring back, I think. We talk a little bit about the Tasmanian tiger in a little bit.
What would be its closest relative?
To the Tasmanian tiger?
Yeah.
There are several species of dogs that were bred in Australia that are direct relatives of the Tasmanian tiger. Tasmanian tiger, we call a Tasmanian tiger, but it's much more close with a wolf in the way that it lived and like its body shape, the niche that it occupied. We'll talk about niches here in a little bit. Okay. Yeah. So probably working backward from some species of dogs is where they'll get the basic DNA strain. And then there are so many bones of Tasmanian tigers that you can probably fill in the spaces pretty easily. Turn on the right traits and so on. But yeah, if you are interested, Colossal is the name of that company. They have a fascinating project. They have a great website. You should definitely check it out. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Let's talk about environments. Life adapts. We figured that out. We discussed that last time. What forces life to need to adapt? Survival. So let's use this classroom. This could get a little weird. This classroom is our environment. If nothing changes in this classroom from the way it is right now, we'll be fine. What happens if we plunge this classroom 50 degrees lower? It gets really cold. Some of us have sweaters, some of us don't, right? How cold will you get before you start fighting over sweaters? What in this room becomes a weapon so you can get a sweater? How many sweaters would you kill for? Okay? Survival of the fittest is what you're getting at there, right? When your environment changes, not everything survives. Sometimes it's through competition with other individuals or species. Sometimes it's through mutation. It's very doubtful that if I were to plug just this classroom 50 degrees lower, right, any of us would all of a sudden develop a mutation to, grow fur and fat like a woolly mammoth. But there are other things that we could do. We could tear apart all of these tables and burn them, right? That might help temporarily. The sweater option is probably a better long-term goal, though that only works well for some of us. However it happens, adaptation is a fact of nature, and everything does it. But it's always in response to what? A change in your environment. All adaptations come because of a change in the environment. If I developed a mutation to grow a third eye, it wouldn't matter a lick unless I was in an environment where more eyesight, more eyes was beneficial. Right? So, what can change in our environment? Well, there's obviously the easy things like the temperature I talked about. What about moisture? How much rainfall you get? That's going to drive a whole bunch of different adaptation changes. For example, where we are now, we've got a lot of mesquite. We've got cactus. We've got all sorts of nasty little weeds. Those thorny ones, I hate those ones. Thorns are the worst, right? Somehow they get in your house and then they get stuck in your rug. So you're walking around your house barefoot, innocent, and you just step on a thorn that got wrapped up in your rug, and all of a sudden your world is ending and it sucks. And then you have to search through the rug until you find it, and you're like, ow, there it is. And then you have to figure out how to untangle it from your rug. When you're homeowners, this will mean a lot more to you, okay? But we get all of these nasty plants that are really good at surviving in low water environments, low moisture environments. But if I were to throw any of those plants into the Amazon, they wouldn't last a week. By the same token, if I were to pull a mahogany tree and plant it in Odessa, it would die off pretty quick too. Organisms are well adapted to their environment, moisture being a major contributing factor to that. Chemistry. That's a big one in the oceans. If ocean chemistry changes, life has to change. Right now, our oceans are actually experiencing a pretty drastic chemistry change. Ocean acidification. Have you heard that term? An unfortunate side effect of the warming that we are experiencing. As our warming increases, it's as a result of what? An increase of what in the atmosphere? Predominantly carbon dioxide. There is this thing called atmosphere-ocean flux, where a certain amount of the gases in our atmosphere are dissolved into our oceans. They try and maintain a sort of balance with each other. As the quantity of, or I should say the ratio of carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, the amount that gets dissolved into the ocean does as well, which slowly turns our ocean more and more carbonic acidy. That's ocean acidification. And what does carbonic acid dissolve? Well, most things given enough time, including seashells and coral reefs. And so as ocean acidification moves onward and gets worse, more and more organisms are going to die or be forced to adapt one way or another. Okay? So these are things that can change in the environment that prompt the need for adaptation. Now notice my terminology there. I didn't say that they cause adaptation, right? By walking into a colder room, I all of a sudden don't grow more hair because I know that I need it. Neither does anything else on our planet. That's not how adaptation works. Adaptation happens through random mutations, and those random mutations are sometimes successful or negative. The ones that are successful get passed on because those individuals survive better. This is the game. Environment changes, mutations happen all the time, and now that the environment has changed, some of those mutations will make a positive or negative effect. And then those go through the population if they are positive. That's how this works. Predation is another major thing. What do we talk about with the megafauna, the Ice Age megafauna? Many of them died off because they couldn't compete with both climate change and humanity. Predation, right? We wanted to eat them. We had a couple hundred years of delicious woolly mammoth burgers, and then they were gone, and we had to move on to cows, right? Which, by the way, may I say, I fully expect in 100 years for there to be woolly mammoth steaks as an option, right? Think about the bison, the North American bison. Do you know the story of the North American bison?
How they were all went to extinction to win a war.
Not all of them, most of them. The vast majority, 99.9999% of all the North American bison were hunted. Part of it was, yes, to deprive Native American populations of a food source and a cultural icon. It was, in part, terror more than anything, right? But we won't get into the cultural and historical ramifications of that. But a lot of it was also, hey, we want to eat that. Okay? Or, hey, we want trophies. People would shoot the bisons from passing trains and then just leave them there. Okay? Whole herds of them. And what I ended up with is that there was only one herd of bison left. In Wyoming, I believe it was. And now here we are, almost 200 years later, and bison, which have been protected since then, have left the endangered species list and are now so common that I can walk to Market Street and I can get bison meat. You can get bison meat almost anywhere now. They've become so common that you can get a license to go and hunt them in Wyoming and Montana. Okay, you can get a bison tag in some places. And they literally farm them and sell the meat. That's where we're at now after 200 years. So we put woolly mammoth populations in Canada. I guarantee it won't be long after that before we start selling woolly mammoth meat on shelves because, they're not endangered anymore. They're a whole thing, right? That's just what we tend to do. I don't know that we'll ever have California condor drumsticks, but I won't put that out of the realm of possibility, okay? All right, so where was I? Competition, we already talked about competition. Habitats. A habitat is an area that's inhabited by life. So you've heard me use the word habitat before. You can think of this room as a habitat. We are inhabiting it and we are alive. I often refer to the glass enclosure that Diablo and my turtle Algernon and my lizard Smaug, I named my lizard Smaug, by the way, that they live in. I call those habitats. Does anyone get the reference, Smaug?
Yeah.
I figured you would. Okay, what is it from? The Hobbit, yes. Smaug is the big dragon in The Hobbit. I 3D printed a dragon, or not a dragon, excuse me, a mountain for my lizard to live in. And his name is Smaug, and he just spends all day curled up in his mountain. Yeah, I'm a nerd, newsflash. All right, so yeah, all of these are environmental changes that cause, or not that cause, but that prompt the need for adaptation. Okay, that terminology, that wording is very specific. Okay, ecology. Sebastian, could you grab that door for me? I forgot to ask earlier. Thank you. If Student Patrol walks by and it's open, I might get an earful later. All right, ecology is the study of life in the environments that they inhabit, within their habitats, or some other terms that we're going to use here in a moment. An ecologist is someone who is interested in the interaction between these organisms in that environment, and the interaction with those organisms and their environment. Organisms often will affect the environment they're in. Can you think of an easy example of an organism affecting the environment it lives in? Us, yes. Do you think that we affect the environment we live in quite a lot? Yeah, we do, whether we mean to or not. You do, I do, our actions do, as a civilization, and have for a long time. We are an example of that interaction, okay? Okay, so some other terminology here. Niche, N-I-C-H-E. That's pronounced niche. A niche is, you can think of it as a space within an environment that an organism occupies. For example, plankton. Plankton occupy a niche in the ocean environment of being at the bottom of the food chain. They are often the bottom of the food chain. That is their particular niche. They are producers that everything else eats. A wolf occupies a certain niche in its environment, being a pack hunter that preys upon certain organisms in its environment. And a Tasmanian wolf, or a Tasmanian tiger, by the way, occupies the very same niche in its own environment. They live on different continents, but they occupy the same niche in different places. Very interesting. We call that coevolution, okay? Convergent evolution. We'll talk more about that later. A population. A population is a group of individuals within a single species in an area. So you and I are the population of this classroom. Okay? However, a community is a whole bunch of populations within an area. So within this classroom, there's a population of humans, a population of snakes, and a population of bugs, insects, right? We probably can't see any of the insects. I guarantee there are some in here somewhere, right? Our pest control isn't that good. But we have a population of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 humans in this classroom, or excuse me, yes, a population of 12 humans and a population of 1 snake, and then whatever else is in here. And all together we make the community. That's what these terms mean, okay? So now that we're a little bit more familiar with the hello. I think that microphone may have turned off. That's fine. Now that we're a little more familiar with the terminology, let's discuss the environments themselves. Environments on Earth tend to form bands around our planet. What have we learned about happens on our planet or around our planet, in the vicinity of our planet, that might explain this phenomenon? Why we might have a band of climate and environment here, and then a different band around that, and a different band further north or further south? Why does it occur in this banded shape?
Because of the
Earth's tilt relative to what? How do we know we're tilted? We're in space. Isn't there like no point of reference in space?
relative to other planets.
Not relative to other planets, relative to, huh? The sun. Right. We know we are tilted based upon the plane of our ecliptic around the sun, right? We are on that 23.5 degree tilt, which, by the way, the fact that we are on that tilt means that a certain band around our planet has more exposure to sunlight year-round. Do you know what we call that band? The equator. The equator is the band around the center of our planet that has the most exposure to the sun throughout the year. That's why it's hotter there year-round than it is to the north or to the south. The north and south poles have the least exposure, direct exposure to the sun year-round. Therefore, they are the coldest. And this is kind of the crux of why we have different bands of environment around our planet. So, the hotter place in the middle, the equator, tends to be warmer and more humid, experiences more rainfall as a result. So we get different types of environments there. Things like rainforests. To the north and south of that, we get slightly less rainy forests, right? And then above and below that, we get things like deserts. And then above and below that, we kind of return to a slightly rainier environment because of air convection taking water, okay, up north and south. And then above that, we get into the cold and dry and then finally polar environments, okay? So we get this banded pattern around our planet. Let's talk about the atmosphere for a minute. What is the composition of gases in our atmosphere? What is the most common gas in our atmosphere? Not hydrogen. Thankfully, light a match and we'd all go boom. Huh? It is nitrogen. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. Most of what you breathe is nitrogen. But is that what we need? Why do we breathe? Is it because we need nitrogen? I mean, we do absorb some of it, and it does fulfill a function in our bloodstream. Have any of you ever been scuba diving, by the way? Yeah? No? Any of you ever want to go scuba diving? Yeah? Oh, absolutely should. You absolutely should. Something that you will learn if you go deep scuba diving, like if you're just near the surface, they probably won't bother telling you this unless you're getting deep sea certified. But if you go too deep, the pressure starts to affect your body, okay? Namely, it starts to compress your blood. Now, that's fine for a little bit, and to a certain depth. You don't want to go too deep unless you have specialized gear. But what's even more dangerous is how you come back up. When they take you down there, they make sure that you have enough air for whatever activities you're going to be doing down below, and enough air so that on your way back up, you can stop. Why do you stop? Because once you go below a certain depth, the nitrogen in your bloodstream becomes dissolved. And then on your way back up, it forms bubbles. That's the nature of nitrogen. Under certain amounts of pressure, and then you decrease that certain pressure, it forms those bubbles. Well, those bubbles of nitrogen in your bloodstream, if they are not allowed the time to make their way through your bloodstream and become redissolved, then they are going to really damage your body. If you ascend too quickly from the depths, they usually have you hang out at about 75 feet for 20, 30 minutes. But if you come back up too quickly, say you're down 150 feet and you come all the way straight back to the surface, you often become afflicted with a condition called the bends, which is when the nitrogen bubbles in your bloodstream clog up your veins. They get trapped in your joints, and they can sometimes even get to your heart and make problems there. But you get partial paralysis. You can have brain damage. You may not ever be able to bend your knees or your elbows again. A lot of medical conditions can come from the bends, which is why they make sure you have enough air to sit right there at about 75, 80 feet. Let it all redissolve back into your bloodstream. But why do I bring this up? Because you and I are breathing so much nitrogen that it literally fills our blood, is what I'm saying. So much of our atmosphere is nitrogen. What's the next most common gas in our atmosphere? Oxygen makes up about 21% of it. That's what you and I need to keep sustaining life in our bodies. We require that oxygen. Have I given you my oxygen talk yet? About what oxygen does? No?
Oh, it slowly kills you.
Ah, yes. Did I give that? Okay, yeah. We need the oxygen to keep surviving, but that oxygen interacting with our DNA, slowly oxidizing our DNA, breaking it down, and our body gets slower and slower and repairing it as time goes on, and that's why we age. The more we age, the more decrepit our bodies get. It's because our bodies can't keep up with the cellular regeneration we need, and they can't keep up with that because we've experienced so much oxidization at the basic level of our cells. Okay, so that's oxygen. But wait, there's still some more. That's only 99% of our atmosphere. Well, there's a little bit of everything else, but most of that everything else is argon. Okay. Argon is released from seeps in the ground. If you have the unfortunate situation of being in a place where there is an argon seep, sometimes it will leak into people's houses and then suffocate them in the middle of the night. Yeah, you can't smell it. You can't really even detect it. Where is argon on our periodic table of elements?
8. Column 8.
Yeah, it's in column 8. It's one of those inert gases, right? So it doesn't bond with anything, which makes it difficult to deal with or to detect. But an excess of argon will prevent you from being able to absorb oxygen, and yeah, it's killed many people. We're getting better at detecting it. This is not very common, but because it does seep from the ground in various places, there is a substantial amount of it in the atmosphere, which is why it makes up almost 1% of it. Okay, so what does our atmosphere do? It traps solar radiation. Well, some of it will reflect off of the upper atmosphere, but then the rest of it makes it through the atmosphere. And then depending on the quantity of which gases we have in our atmosphere, it can stay or it can go. Now, I say 21% of all of the gases in our atmosphere is oxygen, but so much of that oxygen is in some stuff like carbon dioxide, or in some places, carbon monoxide. Anything that has oxide at the end of it, any gas that has oxide at the end of it, has one of those oxygens in it, right? One or more, I should say, right? Like dioxide. So a lot of our oxygens are bound up with other things. Oxygen is a very interesting element, may I say. Okay, oxygen bonds more easily with other elements than a lot of other elements. Okay, which is why it's rare, relatively rare to find stuff like O2 in the wild. Plants may produce oxygen gas, but it often is quickly bound up with something else. Okay, we usually have to produce our own O2, make it ourselves, and then keep it safe in a bottle where it can't bind with other things. It's very reactive. Its reactivity is what has given Earth a lot of its dynamic nature, why we have water, why we have all these gases in our atmosphere, why you and I require oxygen for our blood. Okay? because of the nature of oxygen. But the amount of these greenhouse gases in our atmosphere are going to determine how much solar radiation Earth absorbs. More greenhouse gases, by the way, we call them greenhouse gases because they are larger molecules of gases, okay? Things like carbon dioxide and methane are very large molecules. So gases like that are going to absorb more solar radiation, which means that my solar radiation pierces down through the shell of my atmosphere, bounces off the surface, and instead of leaving the atmosphere again, it loses so much energy on the surface, and then it encounters greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It just keeps zigzagging back and forth until it's expended all its energy here. That's how greenhouse gases cause warming effects. Okay, it traps it traps solar radiation down in the atmosphere. Okay, where it interacts with us and our environment. Now, there are some places on our planet that have more or less gases in the atmosphere, namely the equator versus the poles. Let me do a simple demonstration here. Here we have the surface of our planet, right? Here we have an exaggeratedly thick layer of atmosphere above it. There we go. Okay. So for solar radiation to come through at the equator, it has to go through that much atmosphere, right? Because the sun's over there. The equator's pointed directly at the sun all the time, right? So what if I'm standing here and I am also experiencing that sun? How much atmosphere does that sun have to go through? Does that light? It has to go through that much atmosphere to encounter the surface. Our poles are frigid. They are cold, not only because of exposure to sunlight, but because of the sheer amount of atmosphere that light has to go through to reach the poles at the north and south. Not as much radiation, not as much heat, far colder. Okay? So the distribution of these gases and the thickness of the atmosphere that radiation has to go through is also a factor here. Other things that can cause changes in environment, or that can cause, changes in your environment. Okay? Elevation. Okay? This is something that happens over long periods of time. But remember, we're talking about millions of years here. Evolution, adaptation, this takes millions of years. So we've got tectonics, making mountains, making valleys, dropping elevation, increasing elevation, taking millions of years. So is the change in life. So if I am at one point living at sea level, and then there's a new convergent plate boundary that happens right there, not far from me. And over 1 million years, a mountain range starts to form there. Do you think there's going to be a change in the type of trees that can live there successfully? Yeah. If I've gained 1,000 feet in elevation, that's going to affect the sort of things that can live there. I might not find palm trees on that mountain because palm trees just rather live at sea level. I might find fir trees, right? Like pines. What about at 8,000 feet a couple million years later? I might not even find pines anymore, right? Elevation change can definitely influence your environment and what can live there. Then there's distance, namely distance from water is a huge factor, right? Where we live today, fairly arid. You remember our conversation? Most people consider this to be a desert. And it is kind of a pseudo-desert because of how arid it gets here. By the way, I was talking to a guy who's lived here his whole life. He's like 60 years old. And he was talking about how it just doesn't rain here anymore. How by this time in a year, 40, 50 years ago, we would have had several thunderstorms already. And there was water everywhere. And now it just doesn't rain. We might get one good thunderstorm a year, maybe two anymore in this part of the world. And he was lamenting how different it is. When you experience less moisture, your environment changes pretty drastically. right? We're going to see that more and more as time goes on here. But what if instead it was because our water source got further and further away? What if a river that used to flow right here over the course of a century or 2 centuries or 1,000 years deviates its course way over there and now it's 100, 200, 300 miles that way? That's drastically going to affect the sort of things that can live here. What if a mountain range pops up between me and the coastline because of that convergent boundary that we used as an example before, where organisms may have once been able to access the ocean. Now, 1 million years later, there's a mountain in the way. And it's, by the way, it's stopping the rainfall that comes in off of the ocean, making a rain-shadowed desert where you live now. So the things that are between, the distance between you and a source of water are very relevant to your environment as well. In general, we consider this kind of band, and this is very general, okay? I didn't make them too thin because I wanted you to be able to see what was between them. This central band around the equator, we refer to that as the tropical zone, okay? And then there's kind of this overlap area between the tropical zone and the next one, but this blue area, we typically refer to that as a mid-latitude desert zone, okay? That overlap there, that's going to be like your grasslands and savannas and the things like that. A desert, for the purposes of most studies, is any place that experiences less than 25 centimeters a year of rainfall. Savannas, that's where that blue and red overlap was. So above our tropics, but not quite a desert sort of environment, okay? These are grasslands. Too dry for forests, not so dry that you don't have a bunch of other plants as well, okay? So we probably are somewhere between that savanna and desert environment where we live, okay? We fall somewhere in between that, okay? This is what an African savanna would look like. Then there are your forests, and there are 2 types of forests. You've got your coniferous forest like this, something you would find if you went on a drive through northern Canada. And then you've got your temperate forests, which are much warmer. These are closer to the equator, okay? These are the ones you would see if you drove through, say, Georgia or Alabama. Really anywhere up and down the east coast of the US. You would find temperate forests like this. They get gorgeous in the fall. If you ever want to see the most beautiful trees of your life, go for a drive through Massachusetts in October. Does not get better than that. Every tree, like if you think that's pretty, every tree is orange or red or gold or yellow. And it's too much to take in, and I love it. All right, and then you've got tundra. Tundra is when we're above that coniferous forest zone. It is too cold for any conventional plant, and really all we've got are those mosses I talked about earlier, okay? So large patches of moss kind of spread around. Now, we get a lot of permafrost up here, which makes it difficult for any larger plants to survive. Who can remind me what permafrost is?
Ice that's always there year-round.
It's not really ice. Permafrost. Sebastian, what do you think? Permafrost. Permafrost. Do you remember what permafrost is? Kind of? Give me what you got.
Isn't it like frost that just like sits on top of? I don't know.
It's not frost. The name permafrost is maybe a little bit of a misnomer. It's frozen soil. Sound familiar? It's too cold up there for your soil to completely thaw out. So even in your hottest seasons like spring and summer, only the top few inches of soil can thaw out, and the rest of it remains frozen underneath those top few inches. That frozen component, that is permafrost. It is from the permafrost that we pull out the woolly mammoth tusks and those other really cool Ice Age fossils. It is because the permafrost up there is currently melting that we are finding more and more of those fossils. Have I ever shown you all my necklace? Not Diablo. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this. Ever show this to you guys? I made that, which is probably why it doesn't look impressive, right? So this green gemstone, that's Russian malachite, right? I have a big chunk of it right there on that central table. But this this yellowish white icon here, chunk in the middle, this is woolly mammoth ivory. That's 60,000-year-old woolly mammoth ivory that I got from a trader, Trader, right, in Canada. Every now and then, people from the Inuit tribes will come down from northern Alaska or Canada to trade woolly mammoth ivory for necessities they need, canned goods, knives, whatever they need for their lifestyles up there. Because they know that the crazy people down south, for some reason, like these big bones that come out of the dirt. So they'll bring woolly mammoth ivory down and they'll trade stuff for it. So I got this chunk from him, and he carved into it a bear's paw, which is their symbol for courage. And I've worn it every day around my neck for about 25 years, almost. No, 23 years is when I got this. And I'm sure it helps me a lot, reminds me to be brave and courageous and stuff like that. But this came out of the permafrost, way up in northern Canada. They have so much of this stuff lying around that they use the tusks to build their tents as tent poles. They've got piles of these things lying around, and they don't even know what to do with it. Wow. Yeah, they can't trade it away fast enough. More and more of it washes out from hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years of woolly mammoths living up there, dying, getting incorporated into the permafrost, and then remaining frozen there for so long. And now they are melting out as our temperature increases. Then the permafrost melts, and all the woolly mammoth bones come washing out of the dirt. And now it's around my neck. Any questions so far? No? All right. Let's talk about plants then. Plants are cool. How many of you think plants are cool? Yeah? Okay. You owe more to plants than you think. Plants are really cool. We'll talk about the evolution of plants later on. But plants are made out of some pretty important elements. Most of the mass of a plant is going to be carbon and oxygen. You know that? A bond between carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, yes, which is what makes things like coal and wood fossil fuels that we can burn for energy. We are releasing, using the process of oxidization through heat to crack those elements apart from each other. What is this guy doing? Sorry, I've seen this guy drive around in that blue truck, like up and down the lanes, like 5 times now, and he goes way too fast. Huh? Looking for parking or just showing off his new truck? Yeah, look at that guy. What an absolute moron. Sorry.
I had a woman sit in the turn lane for like a good couple minutes before she actually came to the parking lot.
Yeah. I probably shouldn't start a conversation about how annoying people can be in the parking lot here. Okay, so plants. Carbon and oxygen have these nice little things called isotopes. Normal carbon is carbon-12. Normal oxygen is oxygen-16. But carbon has an isotope called carbon-13, which means it has 1 more neutron than your normal plain Jane vanilla carbon. Oxygen has an isotope called oxygen-18, which means it has 2 more neutrons than your normal plain Jane vanilla oxygen. The ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 and the ratio of oxygen-16 to oxygen-18 are very important for things like paleoclimate studies. This is what my master's thesis was all about, which is maybe why it excites me more than your average Joe Schmo. Okay? But we can use that ratio for a few things. For example, Would you imagine, does oxygen 18 have more mass than oxygen 16? Yes, because it has 2 more neutrons. Which means that when my rain forms in my atmosphere, it's going to preferentially form with oxygen 18. Oxygen 18 bearing rain is going to rain sooner than the lighter oxygen 16. And so by seeing the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 isotopes in a fossil of a plant that absorbed that water when it reached the surface, I can determine how close, I should say, that plant was when it was alive to the equator. Because more oxygen 18 rich rain is going to rain out at the equator than further away from it. So things like that, figuring out these patterns in the natural world and applying them to fossils, it's fascinating. I know I've used this comparison before. It makes me feel like Sherlock Holmes, right? Tying all these clues together and coming to a fascinating conclusion. Like, when this plant was alive in this part of the world, it was approximately 500 kilometers from the equator, right? Things like that. It's so cool. And plants let us do that because guess what? Plants are constantly absorbing oxygen and carbon. Let's think about trees. Trees grow in rings, right? Well, I can do an analysis of all of the rings in a tree and figure out what the ratio of carbon and oxygen isotopes are to each other and see how that changed seasonally. This was a very dry season. This was a very wet season. As time goes on, bless you, I can see over the 200-year lifespan of this tree how it was gradually getting further and further away from things like the equator, things like that. Do you guys know what the oldest tree on Earth is? No, it's actually here in the United States. There are actually several very ancient trees in the world.
In California, the redwoods?
Not the redwoods, those are old, but none of them are quite as old as this. Methuselah is a white pine. And it's about 4,500 years old, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. There are a few other trees, a few in Southeast Asia, I want to say, that are almost or maybe just a little bit older, but they cannot be confirmed. Certain trees, it's harder to confirm, because guess what? To get a hard confirmation, you have to get a core sample. Am I going to chop down what could be the oldest tree in the world to confirm if it was, in fact, the oldest tree in the world, just to get that core sample? No, I am not. And so we can't really confirm that. The oldest one that we can hard confirm is that, and I do want to say it was 4,500 years old, white pine. Nevada, I believe. It's either Nevada or California. Okay. Marine environments. We've talked a little bit about how those can change. Let's dive into that a little bit better, a little bit deeper. Pardon the pun. A current. Do you guys know what a current is? Current as it relates to the ocean, not a currant as a delicious berry. Yes, have you never had currants? You should try black currant jam. Oh, so good. Yeah, black currant jam on a scone with butter. Oh, why do we do this? Why do I do this to myself every time? Yeah, they're tiny little berries, yep. Super good. Okay, but currents, ocean currents. What are ocean currents? Yeah, the water that moves in a repetitive pattern over and over and over, following a certain path, right? Usually, it's because of a change between warm and cold water that is driving these currents. And they are predictable enough that we can map them, okay, for the maritime industry, for boats to know, okay? Also, whales, sharks, fish, all sorts of things rely on these currents for transportation and to bring food to them, okay? Some currents change seasonally. Some remain consistent year-round. Tides, on the other hand, Tides are driven by gravitational pull from the moon. You remember our conversation about tides from 1403? Whichever side of the planet the moon is on, there is a bulge of water that kind of is pulled up towards it, and also a bulge on the opposite side of the planet at the same time, because the water between has gotten kind of pulled thinner. Not enough that you would really be able to tell by looking at it from space, but just enough that we can for sure measure it. And high tides come in wherever the moon is, or whatever side of the planet is opposite the moon. So these things can be long or short-term changes. Your current changes, guess what? Your life is going to have to change as well. Maybe there's not as much food coming without that current, right? There's not as much plankton being shoved in your face if you're a sea anemone. There's not as much krill being shoved down your gullet if you're a whale. Maybe it's a difference in temperature. Maybe instead of a cold water current, now it's a warm water current, and it's bringing different kinds of food, and you better learn to adapt and eat it, or you're going to have to leave. And if you can't leave, you're going to die, right? Salinity. What is salinity? Huh? Bingo! The amount of salt in water. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that most bottled water contains salt? Yeah. Yeah, they call them minerals. If you ever see a bottled water, he purposefully takes a drink while maintaining eye contact with me. Love it. If you ever look at it and it says contains essential minerals or electrolytes or anything like that, that's code for salt. And that's helpful for them because if they give you salt water, even if it's just a little bit, you probably can't taste it that much. But just a little bit of salt, while your body does need it, it does dehydrate you just a little bit. So you keep buying their water, right? It's not because they know it's necessary for your health, whatever they tell you. You get plenty of salt from your normal diet as it is. You don't need it in your drinking water. But the amount of salt in your water is called salinity. Now, you and I are perfectly fine with fresh water. You go and take a drink from the ocean. How many of you have ever drunk seawater? I've drunk far more of it than I ever should have, right? Huh? It's disgusting. You drink some of that and it'll actually kill you. You'll get salt poisoning, okay? But a lot of sea creatures actually require that careful balance of salt in our oceans. If less salt is there, then it throws off their body function. If more salt is there, it'll definitely throw off their body function. The saltiest body of water in the world is called the Dead Sea. Do you know why it's called the Dead Sea? Well, yeah, it's the saltiest body of the world. Nothing can live in it. Absolutely nothing lives in there. With the exception of a few possible, unconfirmed colonies of specialized extremophile bacteria that may be living at the very bottom. There have been a few attempts to go down there and confirm if that's the case. But it's actually surprisingly difficult to get any instruments down there, and definitely to get people down there. Why? Because it is so salty that everything floats on it. You can look up videos of people in the Dead Sea, and they are literally, like, almost all of their bodies are up floating on top of the water. The saltier the water is, the more buoyant things are. So trying sending a submarine or a robot to the bottom of the Dead Sea is very difficult because more things float in salty water. Yeah?
Why is it so salty?
The theory behind why the Dead Sea is so salty is that at one point it was connected to the Mediterranean. It was a much larger body of water. But then it got cut off, and as it got cut off, it started to evaporate. And as it evaporated, all of the salt that was in there, and that got added to it through various geologic processes. For example, there are nearby mountains made entirely out of salt. Okay, so a bunch of salt gets washed in there, and the water keeps evaporating away, leaving the remaining body of water hyper-saturated in salt. Okay, so this is what currents look like. Okay, so all these orange currents where you see these lines where they're kind of swirling around, those are warm water currents. And you can see they are focused around what? The equator. Warm water currents are focused around the equator. There are blue currents, which are cold water currents, and these come from either pole. So we've got northern currents that come down here, down Alaska, down the coast of California. Then we've got cold water currents that come up along the side of South America, so on and so forth. But you can see where the cold water currents eventually turn into warm water currents. And you can see where warm water currents, like up here, gradually turn into cold water currents. Depending on the depth of your water, this can determine a lot about the environments that occur there. Okay? So for example, how far light can penetrate. Light can only go so deep, about 300 to 600 feet deep based on how clear your water is, how clean it is. Okay? So if you have organisms, yeah, of course, yeah. If you have organisms that require photosynthesis as part of their life cycle, guess what? They ain't going to live where the sunlight isn't, right? If you have organisms that don't require sunlight, they can live a lot deeper. So, the tidal zone is the portion where it is the water is so shallow that when the tide is low, it's actually exposed or almost exposed to the atmosphere. And when the tide is high, it's covered in water. So where you've got the alternating back and forth with the tide, we call it the tidal zone. Then you have the photic zone, which is all light, or excuse me, the whole water column as far as light can penetrate, which, like I said, varies between 300 to 600 feet. In real murky water, it may only go about 300 feet. In really clear, nice water, it can go up to 600 feet. Can you imagine being 600 feet underwater and you can look up and you can still see the sun up there? Yeah. But yeah, so that's the photic zone. All the photosynthesizing organisms have to live in that zone. And then beneath that is benthos, which goes from beneath the photic zone all the way to the bottom of the ocean floor, the benthic zone. There are plenty of swimming things that can live in the benthic zone their whole lives. Plenty of things from the photic zone that can go spend time in there for a short time, like whales, sperm whales, for example, will often dive deep under the ocean to go and hunt giant squid and such in the benthic zone. And then they'll come back up and be perfectly content living in the photic zone, right? They can go back and forth. Things that live on the seafloor, like snails, sea slugs, all of that, crinoids, those are in the benthic zone. The food chain in the ocean is based upon planktons. Any change that affects the plankton population is going to cascade upward and affect the populations of things that eat those. So if our plankton are eaten by tiny little krill shrimp, and those tiny little krill shrimp are eaten by a bigger fish, and those bigger fish are eaten by even bigger fish, and those even bigger fish are eaten by sharks and whales and squid and all of that, then any change at the bottom of our food chain, those planktons, any current, any temperature, any salinity thing that affects those planktons is going to cascade up our food chain. That's how it works. Here's an example, very relevant to our world right now. How many of you have eggs in your fridge right now? How many of you enjoyed buying those eggs? I mean, my point is they're expensive right now. My kids eat eggs every morning. A box of 15 dozen eggs from Sam's Club in December was $25. When I had to buy them on Saturday, it was $72. Yes.
Like US dollars? It's so
Like US dollars.
Like in Pecos, a dozen is only like $2 or $3. That's
Well, are those raised there or are they brought in?
just
Because I've got friends who have chickens and are making bank off of selling those eggs. But if you got friends that'll just give you eggs, that's great. Or that will sell them for cheap because they just don't care about market value. But yeah, that many eggs. My kids will go through that many eggs in a few weeks.
I don't know where they come from, and it's not, they're like off-brand that I don't recognize anymore. It's not like the Sunny side or
Uh-huh.
whatever. They're like off-brands I don't recognize. It's only like $2, $3 a dozen.
Gotcha. So you're eating lizard eggs. I'm just kidding. No. But my point is, something affects a part of the food chain at the base, and it cascades up. It is more expensive for me to give my kids eggs because our chicken populations are having a hard time at the moment. Plankton has a hard time. Everything else on the ocean has a hard time. Okay? It works its way up the food chain. This is part of the reason why the dinosaurs went extinct. The asteroid didn't kill all the dinosaurs. It killed all the ones that were close by. Why did all the dinosaurs on Earth go extinct? Because the asteroid put ash in the atmosphere, and that ash cut off sunlight to the plants, and the plants started to die off, and then the herbivores died off, and then the carnivores died off. It's a cascade effect through the food chain. Okay? Far more deadly than you might think. So we have our phytoplankton. Our phytoplanktons are the photosynthesizing, producing planktons, okay, that fill our oceans. You take a mouthful of seawater, you're basically drinking some soup, okay, a very light soup, but still, you know, it's got some living things in there. It's got some little animals and plants in it, okay. Zooplankton and fish larvae will eat the phytoplankton. Okay, zooplankton, you can think of those as the consuming types of planktons, the carnivorous kind, okay. So we've got and we call those pelagic organisms. Those are the ones that float around in the ocean, just kind of pulled around by currents, all right? Then we've got grazers. Grazers are the things that kind of crawl around on the floor, ocean floor, and eat whatever yummy little living things are there. Sea urchins, starfish, sea cucumbers, snails. Snails to an extent. We'll talk about snails in a minute. They go around and they'll eat whatever living things they can find, okay, including each other. Suspension feeders are the ones that are attached to the ocean floor, like crinoids or sea anemones, and they kind of pull in the planktons that have the misfortune of being pulled into their... It's okay if you open it. You don't have to worry about...
She's trying to open it all
as quietly as possible. You can just...
Just rip it open.
Yeah, just don't do it too fast or it'll go everywhere and all of a sudden you're sharing with the class, right? I don't mind if you pop open a snack. Where was I? Suspension feeders. Yeah, so the stuff that kind of sits there in one spot and has these tendrils, these fronds, these tentacles that just pull plankton from the current into a mouth. Okay, those are suspension feeders, like sea anemones. Then you've got deposit feeders, and this is where most snails fit. Okay, gastropods. That means basically snails. Okay, so they essentially, and this is kind of gross, they'll go around and eat mostly the waste from other organisms. Snails literally just go around eating fish poop and stuff. Yeah, they're called deposit feeders because they will absorb the waste from other organisms. And some are actually predators. There are snails that have developed the ability to actually crawl into, say, a clam and drill through it, okay, like a starfish would. But most of them are deposit feeders. Actually, some snails have actually developed even grosser habits of how to eat. If you think it's gross for a snail to wander around and eat other organisms' poop, what if I told you that there are some snails that developed the ability to eat that poop before it was pooped? Yeah. So crinoids. A crinoid is essentially a flower, right? Where you've got a stem and something called a calyx at the top with tendrils. Those tendrils catch plankton, bring them into a central mouth in the middle of the calyx. And that mouth that it eats from is also the one that it ejects waste from. Okay? The mouth is also the anus in these organisms, okay? There are some snails that some time ago, we could see this in the fossil record and we still see it today, learned that they could climb up the stalk, get to the calyx, and then just sit there with their mouth in the crinoid's mouth And as the crinoid is eating and pooping, it'll just eat there out of the crinoid's mouth. It'll just live up there the whole time. Yeah. You all look so disgusted. Nature is great. Talk about an adaptation, right? It's an all-you-can-eat buffet, and you don't have to go anywhere. That poor crinoid, though, right? It's like, get your mouth out of my mouth! Right? Okay, so those are our benthic organisms. And then you've got your larger things, like your whales and your sharks. And those kind of hang out. Where's the... Okay, here we go. I went forward too much. These kind of just hang out in the water column between the photic zone and the upper benthic zone, hunting whatever they're going to eat. And they will eat pretty much all of the rest. Whales, for example, they will eat those planktons. They'll also eat fish. Sharks will eat fish. They'll also eat whales, So it just, that part of the food chain kind of gets a little screwy as things eat each other. But plankton, always on the bottom. Okay, that plankton is always on the bottom there. Then we've got, let's talk a little bit about the salinity here. Okay, so our zones of our ocean, we call these subarctic, transitional, subtropical, tropical, and then here's your subtropical transition, subantarctic, so on and so forth. Okay, we give them these titles based on temperature. Okay, but also salinity does play a role there. The closer you get to the poles, the saltier your water tends to get. Because so much of your water, of the water up there is in the ice, right? But also, we give the different types of salinity of water a term, okay? So typical ocean salinity is between 30,000 to 40,000 parts per million. Varies obviously by proximity to the pole or the equator. Brackish is when your salt water is too fresh. Brackish water is when you have, say, a river that's running into the ocean right there at the interface of the ocean, and the river, that's brackish water. Alan, when we went to that talk last week, right? He was talking about going into those river systems where they reach the water. He actually called it a brackish environment, right? Okay. So hypersaline is when it's too salty. Can you give me an example of somewhere like that? The Dead Sea, right? We just talked about that. Dead Sea, classic example of hypersalinity. The Great Salt Lake in Utah, also hypersaline, okay? And becoming even more so as it evaporates away. The Great Salt Lake doesn't have too much more life in it, unfortunately. Probably by the end of the century, it'll be gone. So now let's talk about freshwater. For something to be called freshwater, it needs to have less than 500 parts per million. So more than that, and you're brackish. Less than that, and you have fresh water. Now, fresh water is a little bit trickier to interpret in the fossil record. Because there's far less freshwater environments than there are ocean environments, right? So the amount of life that has developed in freshwater is significantly less than that is from saltwater. But also, because we have much smaller confined areas of freshwater and fewer things evolved to live in them, and you take into account how rare it is for things to get fossilized in the first place, we have far less data for freshwater systems than we do saltwater systems. But there are some types of planktons that have adapted to live in fresh water, which they kind of form part of the basic food chain there, but also algae and various kinds of molds and such that live in fresh water often form the basis of the food chain there. Freshwater plants will be the basis of a food chain. But in general, we just find that there is much less diversity in freshwater ecosystems historically than there has been in saltwater ecosystems, simply because of the sheer quantity of saltwater living space. Okay, I want you to think of it like this. An ecosystem is like an apartment building. Okay? Many of you don't know how hard it is to find an apartment. You will one day. Okay? At some point, be it at another bigger college, you're probably going to need to find an apartment. That apartment you're going to have to apply for it. There's going to be other people applying for that apartment. Lots of people are going to want that apartment. You need to be the best candidate for that apartment. Okay? Sometimes that means having the best credit score. Sometimes that means not having a criminal record. Sometimes that means you don't have a pet and everyone else does. Okay? Whatever the criteria is, you want that apartment. And there's only so much living space in this apartment building. Think of each apartment as a niche in an ecosystem. That niche is occupied by something already. Your job is to become a better candidate for that niche. Let's say that a new landlord appears on this apartment building. This landlord has different preferences for what his tenants should be. The change in this landlord, by the way, if you haven't caught on, that's a change in the environment. Okay? A new set of criteria that determines what a successful tenant for those apartments will be. If you are ready, then as another tenant becomes unsatisfactory to that landlord and is ejected, you are right there with your own set of criteria that are far better suited to that landlord, and you can slip right in and fill that niche. This is how you can think of an ecosystem. Environmental change happens. Some things cut it, some things don't. If you want to be successful, you need to quickly fill in the niche that was left vacant by a previous organism. In freshwater ecosystems, because the apartment building is so small, right, there are fewer niches to occupy. And so we see less evolutionary diversity through freshwater ecosystems. Whereas in the ocean, where your apartment building is massive, we see more diversity in the oceans than in any other ecosystem ever on our planet. Okay, does that make sense? Did that apartment building example work? You guys get that? Great. Any questions? Nothing? Yeah.
So I guess SpongeBob's accurate.
SpongeBob is accurate. He looks like a kitchen sponge, not an actual ocean sponge.
Well, like the majority of all the other fish, the snail.
I've never watched SpongeBob, so I can't really tell you.
What? I've been wanting to yell SpongeBob ever since you said plankton the first time.
Okay. I didn't grow up with TV. I mean, we had a TV, but we never really stayed in one place long enough to get a cable subscription. So I didn't really watch TV. We had a library of VHS tapes that we brought with us everywhere. And then it turned to DVDs towards the end of my childhood. But we never actually, I didn't have Cartoon Network or whatever SpongeBob was on. So, sorry. Can you forgive me? Oh, Abby says no. It breaks my heart. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, we will call it there for the day then. I'm gonna hold off on Lab 3 for a little bit longer, regardless of what the due date says. You can start it. Let's say we'll start it next week. I want you to have a little bit more of a basis of understanding before we start working on identifying fossils. Okay? So we'll start Lab 3 next week.